Okay. Now we're going to go into the 1600s. And the 1500s was where it really kicked off in terms of slavery actually starting and the royal family getting behind it. The 1600s is really where it kicks off in terms of defining people as black and white, and seeing the overlap between classism and racism, and seeing the way that race and class get played off against one another, which still happens today. So 1601, you got the poor law legislation, okay? It's a parish-based system that categorized poor people in a number of different categories. If you're poor, you're either children, or you're the elderly and the ill, or you're those who are genuinely unemployed, or you're the deliberately lazy, okay? And what this did was it cemented the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. You might have heard that phrase, the undeserving poor. That term now becomes a real thing, where when people look at poor people, one of the categories they have in their mind is, are they deserving or undeserving poor? Around the same time, the British are buying slaves from the Dutch for work on the colonies. So they're not buying slaves to take back to Britain, even though sometimes that ends up happening. They're getting slaves to work on the British colonies, where people are planting sugar and making money from sugar. The first English colony in Northern America is called Jamestown, and that's 1607. Now, around about this time, you got Shakespeare writing plays. Shakespeare dies in 1616, and sometimes around Shakespeare you'll see the word race used, and people have debated a lot about what did the word race mean when Shakespeare was around, and how did Shakespeare think about race. And David Alashoga, in his book Black and British, The Forgotten History, which is, if you want to go in deeper with this stuff, I'd recommend reading David Alashoga. Use all these footnotes I've put here for you for if there's things you want to delve into deeper. I've given you enough footnotes that you can look up this stuff and learn more about it if you want to. He basically says the word race did not mean to Shakespeare and his contemporaries what it means to us. And at the beginning of the quote, you can see he says, Shakespeare's audiences did not come to the globe with anything resembling a modern understanding of the idea of race. Okay. 1618, the city of London, there's these homeless, vagrant children in London. Now, what do you expect the city of London to do when you've got homeless children? I mean, we know what it's like in London to have homeless adults on the streets, right? Tragic. There were homeless children on the streets, okay? What did the city of London do? They basically put them on a boat and sent them to Virginia, where there was a colony where they were planting tobacco. And they were sold there. They were basically sold there as slaves, okay? And on these tobacco fields in Virginia, there were more of these white children than there were African slaves. Okay, so slavery hadn't yet been associated with blackness, for want of a better phrase. It hadn't been associated with Africa yet, okay? Now, between 619 and 622, that's within 3 years, 300 children have been shipped. Within 3 years, that's 100 children a year. Yeah, homeless children in London, okay? By the year 1624, only 12 of them were alive. Almost all of these 300 children died. It's heartbreaking, right? And here we see image bearers not serving and protecting, but instead making money out of the most vulnerable people in society. And we also see that it wasn't race, quote unquote, based. It wasn't race based. It wasn't ethnicity based. Let's go to 1621. You got Robert Sanderson. He's a Calvinist. He becomes a bishop of Lincoln. He preaches a sermon where he calls able-bodied beggars, so he would see these as the undeserving poor. He calls them scabs and filth and vermin of the Commonwealth. He says they should be whipped. Now, this guy, Sanderson, thought that there was a hierarchy in society where God had placed everyone so that the society functioned well. So you kind of got echoes here, haven't you, of Aristotle here and of Neoplatonism coming through. And he thought that people needed to stay within their calling. It was all right for him as a bishop. But what about those poor children, those Londoners who got sent to the tobacco fields of Virginia? So notice how in a sermon, he's dehumanizing image of God bearers. People in the image of God. He's dehumanizing them as vermin, as rats, in a sermon, calling poor people rats. And he's advocating for a fixed hierarchy that doesn't change. There's no idea of a meritocracy that you could climb up if you wanted to. It's this idea that you're fixed and you stay in your position. Okay, let's go to 1646. So Thomas Brown writes, he uses his voice, he uses his assessment to come against two crazy ideas that people had. One of them back then was the idea that Jewish people had a smell to them, and that this smell was a curse because they crucified Christ. Crazy, right? Well, he wrote refuting this, saying that's not the case. He also refuted the so-called curse of Ham, and he pointed out the curse of Ham was on Canaan. So, so this is not why Negroes are black. That was what it was back then. It wasn't actually saying that black people should be slaves, but people were saying that black people were black because of the curse of Ham. He refuted that. And he also said that black wasn't a deformity, it wasn't a curse, and it wasn't outside of Aristotle and Galen's canons of beauty. So in Aristotelian thought, there was certain things that were beautiful and certain things that weren't beautiful. And if you had a certain face, then you could be considered as beautiful. And what Thomas Brown was saying is saying black people fall within that. They are beautiful. The fact that he had to say this shows some of the ideas that have been forming in people's minds. But it's great to see this guy speaking up and serving and protecting. But then in 1655, you got this bloke, Isaac Le Pereira, and you might have read about him in some systematic theology because he's a very significant character. He lived in Bordeaux. He did originally anyway. He had a Calvinist background. And he wrote a book about the Pre-Adamites. Okay, let me do something about this flicking light here. So he wrote a book about these Pre-Adamites. He basically said that before Adam, there was a whole bunch of people. Now, of course, this would sound a bit weird. Back then, a lot of people were studying the Bible and getting their beliefs from the Bible. And so what he said, look, in the Bible, these people descended from Adam. That is just the history of the Jews. It's not the history of all of humanity. It's just the history of the Jews. And so there's other types of people out there who existed before Adam, and they are other people groups. Now, he was considered a heretic, and within a year, there had been like 12 rebuttals written against him. So people, image bearers straight away were like using their assessment, using their voice to say, hey, this is proper dodgy stuff. Whilst this guy's using his assessment and his voice in a very dangerous way. And I guess one of my challenges to us all tonight is, where are the voices today? When people are saying stuff that's unbiblical about class, about race, about human beings made in God's image, where are the voices who are speaking out and saying the Bible says this, we must act accordingly? Now in the 1660s, King Charles, remember all the royals from this time period as supporting slavery, King Charles started a company called the Royal African Company. Sounds like a great name for a company, Royal African Company. Well, what do? They trade slaves. This is the most powerful man in the country, using his power not to serve and protect, but using it to subdue people, to trade slaves. And then 1661, you get the slave code. If you forget anything else from tonight, please remember the slave code. This is huge. This is huge for how every one of us in this webinar thinks about people and thinks about race. In 1661 in Barbados, it's the wealthiest part of the British West Indies, okay? I say British as in the British-owned West Indies. And basically, people were planting sugar, and people loved buying sugar. You know, people were proper into sugar. So you can make a lot of money planting sugar and harvesting sugar. Now, to do all this planting, it's funny, technically the people who run the plantations are called the planters, but they weren't actually the people planting. The people who were actually doing the planting were the indentured servants. So these were the Irish or poor British people, okay, who would sell themselves for 7 to 9 years. And they do a deal where they would sell themselves as an indentured servant for 7 to 9 years, knowing that it would be up at the end of the 7 to 9 years. They were treated badly, okay? They were treated badly. And England had a civil war between 1642 and 1651. And at the end of that civil war, the labour had really dried up, okay? So they couldn't get enough indentured servants on these plantations. So they started using more African slaves, okay? And in Barbados, they're doing this with sugar. And in Virginia, they're doing this with tobacco. Same with the Carolinas and Maryland. Now, the thing is, they ended up with a lot of slaves, a lot of African slaves, and a lot of indentured servants. And they realized that there could be a rebellion very easily. I mean, they weren't treating these people well, right? So people could very easily rise up. They were outnumbered. So they came up with what was called the slave code, okay? And what this did was it divided all the workers into either white servants or Negro slaves. So they divided them up so that there wasn't a sense of solidarity amongst them. And the way they divided people was to do with your rights. So if you were a black slave, there were some terrible punishments you could get. You could be killed and you could be mutilated, okay? But with the white servants, they said, you will have lesser punishments, okay? And with the white servants, they said, you can only be found guilty if you have a trial by jury. But the black slaves didn't get that. The white servants were protected by English common law. The black servants weren't. So what they were doing was they were basically putting the white indentured servants, in terms of their legal rights, they were putting them on the same side as the white plantation owners. And they were like communicating to them, you're with the white guys. And then the black people are put over here as you're over there. Now, are you going to want to rebel? You know, imagine 1 minute there's solidarity. You've got black and white, basically slaves together, treated terribly, thinking, shall we uprise? And then the next minute, the white guys are told, hey, stick with us. We're going to give you all these privileges. Well, are you still going to rebel? Like, you're not going to want to be treated like the black servants. And so what they did, David Alashoga words it this way, that they blurred, quote, the distinctions of classes in order to bring racial differences into sharper relief, end quote. So they basically ignored class, okay, and they ignored ethnicity. They ignored whether you was Irish or whether you was English, or you know, the English did not like the Irish much, treated them pretty badly. They ignored that, and instead all Europeans were considered white. and all Africans were considered black. And this is how crazy it was, as in how new a concept this was, how mind-changing it was, paradigm-shifting it was. When new Europeans came to the island, when they came to Barbados, this new term white had to be explained to them. It wasn't like you was in England and you was like, I am a white man and I am going to Barbados to see what's happening with the white planters and the black slaves. It's more like you are just going from England to the plantation, you get to Barbados, you get off the boat, you go and have your whatever refreshments they were having back then, and then someone says, I say, old chap, let me just explain one thing to you that really help you, and then they explain to you, you're white. And you have to have this whole paradigm explained to you. Now, the same concept then got used in Virginia, but because we're focusing on British history more than American history, we're not going to go there, but you can look that up as well. So what you see here is that image bearers use their powers of assessment and their voice to divide image bearers so they could misuse power. So remember, Bavinck said, you still got all those faculties as an image bearer, but because of the fall, instead of them being used to further God's purposes, they're used to further the flesh. And that's what these planters did. And it has changed the way we think about skin tone today in Britain. Crazy. Okay, back to this pre-Adamite business. In 1662, Edward Stilling Fleet wrote a book with a section that refuted pre-Adamism. So there were plenty of Christians who were saying this idea of there being a bunch of humans before Adam is crazy. And he said, it's hard to conceive of how the effects of man's fall should extend to all mankind, unless all mankind were propagated from Adam. So he's assessing the Bible, and he's saying the Bible says all humanity is impacted by sin that comes from the fall at the garden. Therefore, all of humanity must be impacted, or must be descended from Adam. Now, that's going on. Meanwhile, plantation owners, right? These planters, they start exclusively using black slaves. I'm not too sure at what point this was exactly. But Akala, and if you haven't read his book, you've got to read his book, Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of the Empire. It's well worth reading his book. Akala points out that when this happened, it was violating a professed Christian ethic of universal brotherhood. And he also points out that at this point, black skin no longer signified humanity, but, quote, black skin became a signal of merchandise rather than humanity, property rather than personhood, end quote. That is quite heartbreaking. To think that this actually happened, that in people's mind, when they saw black skin, they thought of property and they didn't think of people made in God's image. So black image bearers were not seen as representing God, which is the way that God created all of us, to be seen as representing him. And notice this critique that the world rightly levels at Christianity, that this violated a professed Christian ethic of universal brotherhood. Christians have said everyone comes from Adam. There's a universal brotherhood of humanity. And at the same time, in terms of slavery, doing black slavery, at the same time was totally contradicting that. And so it's one of the reasons why it's worth reading Akala, because as a Christian, if you're a Christian, you want to know, well, how are people critiquing us about this? We need to respond. We need to respond the right way. In London, loads of young people now have read Akala's book. They know about this. So we, the church, have to respond and use our voices to respond well to this. Now, around about this time in the 60s, maybe 1668, but I found it hard to find what exact year this was, but you got the famous philosopher, the English philosopher, John Locke, and his views about Negroes and Native Americans is disturbing. He saw Negroes quote unquote, as subnatural or subhuman. Didn't see Africans as properly human. But Native Americans, he saw them as a bit better. He thought they were the lost tribes of Israel. Remember, we talked about this before. The northern tribes in the Old Testament, they got exiled. And then people were like, what happened to them next? And there was a whole school of thought in England of people saying that the British are the lost tribes of Israel, which is interesting. And I sometimes wonder how many hymns have been influenced by that thought. I'm not too sure. But what Locke said was that Native Americans should be treated well, because they're the lost tribes of Israel. But he also said they're not equal to the colonists. Isn't that interesting? The colonists were the English, the Dutch, the German, the Swiss, and he's saying, no, they are higher than the Native Americans, who are the so-called lost tribes of Israel. And you notice in Europe that the Bible's often read in a European-centric way, not realizing that we're not hardly mentioned in the Bible, So Europe is mentioned, like Paul talks about preaching the gospel all the way to Illyricum, But that's Albania. Yeah, that's not Britain, So anyway, John Locke thought that neither groups could actually reason. So again, this is this idea about assessment, thinking Negroes can't reason. Native Americans can't reason, but he did think that the Indians, quote unquote, could be educated, unlike the Negroes. Okay, so here we're starting to see these ideas. One of the most influential philosophers, isn't he? John Locke. And he's given this idea that there's certain people groups that are more intelligent than others. Now, at the same time, in the late 1600s, you've got these private traders. They're wanting to get in on the slave trade in action. You remember the king. The king is running things at the moment with the slave trade. He's got his own company, the Royal African Company, right? Well, private traders, they campaign. They set up like a GoFundMe page and all that kind of stuff, or whatever the equivalent was back then. And they say, we want permission to slave trade. And check out their reason. It was an Englishman's right. So they were arguing that it was their right and that the king was messing with their rights, depriving them of their rights, that they weren't allowed to trade slaves. So you got a really perverted view of power, of how power should be used, and a really perverted view of human rights. At the same time, I keep saying at the same time, this is not all technically at exactly the same time, but it's kind of like overlapping, 1680, St. Kitts, okay? You got the sugar planters there, and they say to the lords of trade, quote, it is as great a bondage for us to cultivate our plantations without Negro slaves as for the Egyptians to make bricks without the straw, end quote. Check that out. They're taking the Bible story of when the Egyptians said, right, now you Hebrew slaves, you don't even get straw to make your bricks. And these plantation owners are claiming that they are in the same bondage because they don't have Negro slaves. They need more slaves. So you can see the perverted biblical assessment of how they're applying scripture to their situation. You can see the victim mentality that people are having, that British people are having, and you can see how Africans are being seen as commodities to serve them, not that image bearers are serving together. Okay, then 1684, Francois Bernier. He's a physician and he's a traveller. He divides humanity up into 4 species. This might not seem shocking to us because we've grown up in a world where you get told this is your race and there's other races. Before this point, no one thought like that. There was just this one species of humans, although as we've seen, there were hints at thinking it another way. But Francois Bernier, he then says, look, there's one race which consists of Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And he also included some American Indians in that. And then he said there's a second race, which is sub-Saharan Africa. And then there's a third race, which is Muscovy, some of Southeast Asia, China, and the land between China and Russia. And fourthly, there's the Lapps. Okay, so he came up with these 4 races. And thinking back to what we did on the image of God, he is creating a min or a genos. Remember the Hebrew word min for all the different types of animals and the different types of plants that they would produce according to their kind, according to their Hebrew word min, or according to the Greek word in the Septuagint, genos. Okay, so that's what Bernier is doing with the human race, even though scripture has a contrast where with humanity it just says in the image of God, so made after the divine type. In 1684, you get this concept. No, there are 4 species of humanity. This is huge. 4 years later, 1688, Gregory King, he didn't actually write this in 1688, he wrote it in the 90s. But in the 90s, he said, in 1688, in English society, here's all the different ranks of society. And he came up with this whole hierarchy, and he said how many numbers of people were in each rank. And basically, although there were loads of different ranks in this hierarchy, there was a line in the middle of it, and you had stuff above the line and stuff below the line, okay? And the groups above the line were the people who were increasing the wealth of the kingdom. But the people below the line were the people who were decreasing the wealth of the kingdom, okay? And below the line, you had common soldiers, paupers, and at the very bottom of the list, you had vagrants as gypsies, thieves, beggars, etc. So here you can see in England this idea of rank, this kind of class system, almost like a 2-class system, above the line and below the line, and it being based on economics. How much wealth do you create in the kingdom? So we can see that this was a time where people in England were obsessed with creating wealth. And so we can understand part of the way of thinking about class, and also part of the way of thinking about slavery, that people were wanting to create wealth. 1691, there's a London journal called the Athenian Mercury, and each edition, readers would send in questions and they would try and answer the questions. And one of the questions they got was whether Negroes should rise so at the last day. In other words, at the day of resurrection, will Negroes look like Negroes? And the answer was that because, quote, this blackness of the Negro to be an accidental imperfection, they would not arise with that complexion, but leave it behind him in the darkness of the grave, exchanging it for a brighter and better at his return again in the world. Okay, so these guys are saying, look, the whole black skin thing is an accidental imperfection. So they're saying it's not perfect, and I think by accidental, although I'm not too au fait with English language in the 1600s, but I think by accidental, they're saying it's not essential to these people, but I could be wrong. And they were saying at the resurrection, they will look different. So you can see how ethnocentric that was. You know, it's not even the question of, well, what about white people? What, you know, are they going to be white? Are they going to have more melanin in their resurrected bodies? You know, nothing like that. But at the same time, notice that the second question they got asked in this journal was, did people exist before Adam? To which they said, Adam was called the father of all living. So you've got people here who they're against the Pre-Adamite stuff. They're acknowledging that Africans are descended from Adam, just like Europeans, that they're made in the image of God, that they would be resurrected alongside Europeans when Jesus comes back. So good things in contrast to some of the nonsense that was going around at this time. And yet at the same time, they're not seeing black skin as a good thing. They're not seeing it as part of God's creation and as something beautiful. Even though there have been people, as we saw earlier, who had argued that even in classical thought that it fits within that category of beauty. So their assessment is centered on whiteness. It's making whiteness the norm and judging everything else based on that, which obviously you look, for us who realize that Jesus and that most of the characters in the Bible wouldn't have looked very white like how I look. It's very interesting to see that in the 1690s that people in England are debating the Bible and theology and doing it in a way that is centered around whiteness, not realizing how ridiculous that is. Okay, 1693, you've got Charles Blount. He's an English deist. He's not a Christian. And he says this in Oracles of Reason. He says, Adam, who Moses made only to be the first father of the Jews, whilst others hyperbolically made him to be the first father of all men. He also said the flood was localized, so Noah was not the chief of mankind. So this is what's going on, right? People are having a hard time. People are more aware of Africans than they ever were before. People are finding it hard to just say Africans are descended from Adam and they're made in the image of God, just like the rest of us. And people are trying to come up with theories to explain African people. And as we saw earlier, one of the theories is, there must have been people before Adam. And people thinking maybe that's where black people come. They were another group before Adam. And another one was tied in with this was to say the flood was localized. Now, I'm not suggesting we get into a debate tonight about was the flood localized or a worldwide flood. But what I'm saying is people started making arguments to say that when you read Genesis, you are only reading a history of Jewish people. And in reality, throughout history, there have been other people groups in other places that aren't mentioned in Genesis. And either they were before Adam, or they were born at different times or whatever. But stories like the flood was really only for the Jewish people. It wasn't for all of mankind. Why? Well, because if the flood was for the whole world, then it would mean this whole pre-Adamite theory wouldn't work anymore, wouldn't it? Because it'd be like they all died in the flood, and we're all descended from Noah. But people couldn't accept the idea that we're all descended from Noah. So it's very interesting the theories people start coming up with. The following year, 1964, you get a bishop, Richard Kidder. He does a commentary on the Pentateuch. And he says this, I love this. He said, and just encouraging to see that there were Christians who were saying the right thing at this time. He says, God thought fit to make one man to be the head and parent of the whole race of mankind. So he's basically saying, look, God made Adam, and Adam was the dad, the great-granddad of all humanity, of the whole race of mankind. He's using the word race here in terms of all of human race. And he says that men might not boast and vaunt of their extraction. So he's saying so that people wouldn't be like, look at my extraction. Look at where I come from. I'm better than other people. And original, as the Jews have observed, and that they might think themselves under an obligation of love and assist each other as proceeding from the same original and common parent. I love that. He's saying, look, this is practical. Being descended from Adam is practical because God's done it this way so that we would understand we have an obligation to love other human beings. We have an obligation to treat other human beings with dignity and worth. We're from the same family. We're all made in God's image. I really love that. Right, last thing on this century. We end on a shocking note. I'm just a few miles down from Putney right now, and a few miles down from Putney in 1695, this is what was going on. The London Gazette, this is a newspaper, said a black boy about 13 years old run away the 8th inst from Putney with a collar about his neck with this inscription: "The Lady of Broomfield's black, in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Whoever brings him to Sir Edmund Broomfield's at Putney shall have a guinea reward." Now, this is just down the road from me, okay? There's a 13-year-old boy, who has a collar round his neck. And it says "The Lady of Broomfield's black" on it. Can you imagine being that boy that every day you got that collar round your neck? And he ran away at the age of 13. So obviously he was mixed up in the slave trade. He would have been captured or born as a slave. This whole concept of perpetual slavery and it being hereditary and passed on to your children. And someone at some point traveled back to London and brought them with him, even though officially, technically, people were like, no, the air's too pure in England for slaves to breathe it. We don't really do slavery in England. And someone puts an ad in the newspaper and an editor okays it and it's printed and it goes out there. So what you're seeing here is it's not just an individual sin. This is not an individual sin of slavery. This is a system involving newspapers. It's involving a whole industry. It's involving readers of newspapers. It's involving kidnappers. Because what they're saying is, any of you slave catchers out there, you can make some money here. Capture this 13-year-old boy. And they're using their power, but they're not using it to serve and protect. They're using their voice by using the printed word in the newspaper. They're using another category of being made in the image of God, enjoyment. They're taking that form of enjoyment, which is newspaper reading, and they're using relationships by they're saying, you're our readers. Some of you are in Putney, so come on, guys. They're using all these things together to kidnap, imprison, would have undoubtedly led to beatings when he was captured, if he was captured, all these things together. And, people have different terminologies and stuff like that, but this is what some people would call systemic sin. Just like in Egypt, it wasn't enough to have a pharaoh who wanted slaves. You had to have slave masters. You even had to have midwives who would play along with the system as well. You needed a system to keep it going. And what we see here in London at the end of this century is a wicked system in place that would publicly advertise the capturing and slavery of a 13-year-old boy. So I think one of the things this shows us is that we cannot trust our culture to tell us what's right and wrong. If they could get it so wrong in 1695, they could also get it very wrong today. And if even Christian theologians were getting it wrong when they were looking at this topic in the Bible, we can get it wrong today. And we've really got to be diligent with searching the scriptures and seeing what does the Bible say about the human race and how are we supposed to treat one another. And is it possible that we got it wrong? And is it possible that we've been influenced the wrong way by key voices in our history?